Hello everyone, Interact back here again with another episode of Entity Education. In this episode, we're going to be covering all of the various Slowdown perks in Dead by Daylight, and weighing their pros and cons. I'm going to cover every Slowdown perk, even the extremely minor or underused ones, in detail, so buckle up. Also, just for the sake of convenience, I'm going to go in order that they appear on your perk loadout screen while your language is set to English, which is kind of pseudo-alphabetical order since rarity still exists for some unknown reason. I will also only be talking about perks at their maximum rank, so keep that in mind. At the end of the video, after I've talked about all the pros and cons of each perk, I'll make a quick little tier list of them. The first Slowdown perk that we start off with is Dying Light. Dying Light is a teachable perk from Michael Myers and is unlocked at level 40. Dying Light is an obsession perk, meaning a survivor in your match will be the obsession. Firstly, Dying Light will increase the speed at which your obsession unhooks and heals other survivors by 33%. Each time you hook a survivor who is not the obsession, and your obsession is still alive, you will gain a token. Each token will slow down every survivor who is not the obsession by 3% on their generator and healing speeds. If you kill your obsession, this perk will cease to function. So let's get into the pros and cons of Dying Light, starting with the pros. The first pro is that Dying Light is a passive perk, and will help you out as the game goes on and you're just playing normally and hooking people. You don't have to go very far out of your way to make it function. Just keep in mind that hooking your obsession does not give you a stack. The second and final pro to Dying Light is that it slows down healing speeds as well as generator repair speeds. This makes it doubly effective at slowing survivors down in the match, assuming that they are actually healing themselves. Now let's move on to the cons list, which is a little bit bigger. The first and biggest con of Dying Light is that it is just a win more perk. You gain more stacks from hooking survivors, but if you're already hooking survivors enough to get high stacks of Dying Light, then you're probably already winning the match. It takes 5 stacks to make this as potent as Thanatophobia. If you've hooked non-obsession survivors 5 times, then either you've already killed a survivor, or 2 of them are on death hook already, and you're probably doing just fine. You don't really need to be slowing them down by 15% since they're already under a lot of pressure or just dead. The second and most obvious con to Dying Light is the whole business about how it doesn't affect the obsession, and it actually buffs them and makes them able to unhook and heal other survivors 33% faster. So not only is it not going to slow the obsession down on generator repairs if they just want to sit on gens and slam them out, but it will make them even quicker to unhook and heal up their teammates. And the final nail in the coffin for Dying Light, in my opinion, is the fact that it stops working once the obsession dies. Even if you've hooked everybody, say, twice, and you're sitting pretty at 6 tokens or 18% slowdown, if you kill your obsession, the perk just becomes dead in the water. No more slowdown whatsoever. Next up, we have Hex Huntress's Lullaby. Hex Huntress Lullaby, Huntresses, I'm not sure, is obviously a teachable perk from the Huntress, who else would it be from, and is unlocked at level 40. Hex Huntress Lullaby is obviously a Hex perk, it's in the name, and will therefore have a Hex totem spawn on the map while you have it equipped. Lullaby will make any failed skill check have an extra 6% regression penalty on top of the normal 10%. And every time you hook a survivor, you will gain a stack, up to a maximum of 5 stacks. Every stack that you gain will mess with the time of the sound cue for skill checks appearing by 20%, up to 5 stacks just straight up removing the sound cue altogether. The extra 6% regression penalty is what we're mainly focused on here, and 6% regression on a generator failed skill check, in addition to the normal 10%, equals out to 12.8 seconds of regression on a generator. So now let's get into the pros and cons for Hex Huntress Lullaby, starting with the pros. The first pro is the extra regression from failed skill checks is just passive as long as the totem is actually up and active. It starts working the moment the match begins, even if you only have 0 tokens. The second pro is that, like all other Hex totems, survivors may waste time looking around the map to cleanse it if they don't want to just ignore it and power through. This is obviously time that they aren't spending on generators, but is also kind of hit or miss. They could waste no time at all because they spawned right next to it, or they could waste entire minutes. It's really up to chance. The third pro is that it just kind of has a passive benefit in addition to that extra regression as long as it stays up. Sure, you need to hook survivors to gain stacks to make it actually start to function, but that's part of what you're going to be doing in the first place while you're playing Killer. You don't have to break out of your normal gameplay loop to make Lullaby work, it just sits there and does its thing while you're hooking people and getting more stacks on it. The fourth and final pro is honestly just kind of the main draw of the perk in the first place. Once you start getting tokens, skill checks being separated from their sound cue can be very confusing to some survivors if they aren't paying attention. This can result in failed skill checks, which will not only regress the generator's extra amounts due to the passive, but will also give you some intel on where survivors are working on those generators. So now let's move on to the cons list. The first con, and my biggest issue with Lullaby, is a change that behavior made a while back, where as soon as a survivor so much as even thinks about touching a generator, they'll get a notification that Lullaby exists. It doesn't even have the courtesy of waiting for you to have one stack, it just tells them right out of the gate. The second con is that if survivors are just watching their screens while they're working on generators, they don't really need a sound cue, they can just kind of use their eyes. They still get the visual of the skill check on their screen like they normally would, it just kind of removes the sound cue and can be disorienting, but not if they're using their eyes. And the final con, and my biggest gripe with Lullaby, is just that it isn't impactful enough. Requiring 5 hooks to make skill checks completely silent, which is kind of a dubious benefit anyways, just seems so underwhelming for a hex perk that can be removed from the game by survivors. I personally believe that this wouldn't even see that much play if it were a non-hex perk, so I don't know why it's a hex perk in the first place. And next up is the big man on campus itself, Hex Ruin. Hex Ruin is a teachable perk from the Hag and is unlocked at level 35. Hex Ruin is also a hex perk, and will make a hex totem spawn on the map when equipped. Hex Ruin will make it so that good skill checks will give a 5% regression penalty to a generator, and great skill checks will give a 0% bonus to generator progression. Hitting a good skill check will not only regress the generator by 4 seconds, but also waste an extra roughly 3 seconds by making the generator just not repairable. Making great skill checks give 0% instead of their normal 2% or 1.6 seconds of extra progress is an added benefit if survivors are able to ace every single skill check. Given that the percentage chance of a skill check to appear is 8%, and this is checked every second during a repair, a single survivor will get roughly 6 to 7 skill checks per generator if they work on it from start to finish without any breaks. If they ace every skill check, this means it will take them roughly 10 seconds longer than normal to finish the generator with Hex Ruin activated, and if they are missing skill checks, it will take even longer. So now let's get into the pros and cons of Hex Ruin, starting with the pros. The first pro is, did you hear the explanation for the perk? The perk does a lot of work when it comes to slowing generator repair speed down. I honestly can't remember how killers even played before Hex Ruin was a thing. Not only does it demand great skill checks to not just flat out stop survivors from working on a generator from 3 seconds and regress it a bit, it also removes the normal extra progress from great skill checks if survivors are good at hitting their skill checks. There is a good reason that about 90% of killer players, I made that number up by the way, are running Ruin or saving up their blood points to get Ruin. It is kind of just the best perk for slowing the game down. The second pro is the same as I stated on Lullaby, it's a hex totem. So survivors can't or don't want to deal with Hex Ruin, they're going to waste their time looking for the totem to cleanse it. As I stated earlier as well, this could waste just only 14 seconds of their time if they spawn right next to it, or it could waste entire minutes if for some reason they think they can't just power through it until Hex Ruin is gone. The third and final pro is that like a fair amount of good slowdown perks, it's just passive. You equip it, and then you just play the game as you normally would. No extra steps or warping of your normal gameplay loop required. Slap it on, and it just works. Now let's move on to the cons list, which might have more cons than you might be expecting. The first and most obvious one that everyone is going to see coming is that it's a hex perk, and can be rendered a dead perk if survivors find your hex totem quickly. This, as I stated previously, is really just up to chance, the map that you're on, and how good of hiding spots it has. I'm looking at you, Crotus Prime, with your stupid little totem in a literal open field with nothing around it, and the map knowledge of the survivors that are in your match. The second con is one that might not seem obvious, or something that people might just not consciously realize. But I'm talking about how ubiquitous Ruin has become. As more and more killers run Hex Ruin, and it shows up on the Shrine of Secrets more often, survivors get more and more experience dealing with it. This has led to it almost becoming a non-factor in some high-ranked matches. I'll explain a bit more of exactly what I mean here, since this might just kind of be confusing and you might be wondering what the hell I'm rambling on about. Since everyone and their mother runs Hex Ruin, for the most part, survivors have gotten more and more confident in either just working through Hex Ruin and not wasting their time going out of the way to find the totem, have gotten just better at hitting great skill checks all the time, or have all the totem spawns memorized and can find it really quickly. Hex Ruin is no longer the boogeyman, it's just kind of become the norm. It's the regular at the bar that you frequent. It's the coworker that always says good morning to you when you get into work. I'm more surprised and concerned when I go into a match as a survivor and I don't see Hex Ruin. Just like how you might feel if that regular weren't at the bar nursing a drink, or the coworker didn't show up and greet you. You might feel kind of a little off. That's just kind of how commonplace Ruin has become. The next perk that we have is Overcharge. Overcharge is a teachable perk from the Doctor, and is unlocked at level 40. Overcharge will make it so that after you kick a generator, the next time a survivor begins working on it, they will be given a tremendously difficult skill check. If failed, this will explode the generator and give an extra 5% regression. Once again, a generator explosion is 10% regression baseline, and with the extra 5%, this will total out to 12 seconds of regression on a generator. Now let's discuss the pros and cons of Overcharge, starting with the pros. The first pro of Overcharge is that the skill check can be kind of difficult to hit, especially if survivors aren't expecting to see the Overcharge skill check. This can be a bit of a shock factor, leading to it working at least once or twice on survivors who haven't actually seen that you have Overcharge equipped yet, or maybe aren't experienced enough to nail the skill check. The second pro of Overcharge is that if it works, in addition to giving a decent amount of regression on the generator, it will also give you intel on what generators survivors are touching. This doesn't really slow the game down directly, but it can help you track down what generators survivors are trying to touch, and maybe you can find them and keep your pressure up. So now moving on to the cons for Overcharge. The first con is that, it's not that great of a perk. As I stated previously with some of the other perks, being a passive perk that doesn't have you warp your normal gameplay loop to make it work is a big plus. Overcharge is kind of the exact opposite of that. You have to go out of your way to kick every single generator that you see that has a decent amount of progress on it, or Overcharge will be deader than a timely Halloween event this year. And every generator that you will go out of your way to kick is 2 seconds of time that you could be fine spending survivors to chase, injure, down, or hook, in addition to the time that you're taking to walk up to the generators. The second con is that without the aid of extra perks, namely Unnerving Presence, typically, the skill check isn't actually all that hard for more experienced survivors to hit. If survivors are able to hit the skill checks, then all the time you wasted walking up to and kicking the generators to apply Overcharge is just that, wasted time. And Killer, especially at higher ranks, is a game of seconds. You don't really want to be wasting your time not chasing, injuring, downing, and hooking survivors whenever possible. The next perk up is Pop Goes the Weasel. Pop Goes the Weasel is a teachable perk from the Clown and unlocked at level 40. Pop Goes the Weasel will make it so that after hooking a survivor, Pop will become active for 60 seconds. If you kick a generator while it is active, it will apply 25% regression to that generator. This means it will be a 20-second regression to the generator kicked while it is active. So let's talk about the pros and cons of Pop Goes the Weasel, starting out with the pros. The first and most obvious is the amount of regression that Pop puts out. Taking away 20 seconds of a generator cannot be understated. As I said earlier, Killer is a game of seconds, and 20 is a lot of damn seconds to take away from survivors working on generators. So, let's now move on to the cons for Pop, and this might come as a bit of a surprise for a lot of you if you've been watching my videos for a long time, since I've been championing Pop Goes the Weasel for quite a while now, but I do have a lot of cons for it. The first con, and probably the expected one at this point in the video, is that Pop is not a passive perk. You do need to go out of your way to find a generator with enough progress on it to be worth kicking after you've hooked a survivor. This can waste not only the amount of time required to get to the generator, and then the 2 seconds required baseline to kick the generator, but also, you might just not know where a generator is, and you kind of waste your time meandering about the map to find a generator worth using Pop Goes the Weasel on. Which kind of segues us into the second con for Pop Go with the Weasel. You only have 60 seconds to actually make it work after you've hooked somebody. Sure, it's a lot better than it used to be back when you only had 30 seconds. However, there may be times when you have to decide between chasing a survivor that was on the generator and injuring or downing them, or using Pop Goes the Weasel on that generator. Let me just say that choosing to chase is almost always the correct option, meaning that you may end up just kind of wasting your procs of Pop Goes the Weasel. The third con for Pop is that unless you have been running past generators during a chase and noticed that they have a fair amount of progress on them, or you're playing with literally one of 2 add-ons in the game, All-Seeing Spirit for the Wraith and Fuming Mixtape for the Legion are the add-ons in case you didn't know, that let you actually see generator progress, you don't have any guarantee of knowing where a good generator to regress is. And the fourth and final con for Pop Go with the Weasel is that sometimes that generator that you were going to use it on, once you ended the chase and you've hooked the survivor, when you run towards it, it just gets finished. And then you're back to square one of not knowing where the hell to use it. And trust me, you don't want to be wasting your time bumbling around the map looking for a generator to kick when you could just be chasing and injuring survivors. Next up is Thanatophobia, which I'm probably going to mispronounce. Thanatophobia is a teachable perk from the nurse and is unlocked at level 35. I'm just going to call it Thanat from now on. Thanat makes it so that for each injured, dying, or hooked survivor, each survivor will gain a 4% penalty to their healing and repair speeds. This means that it will take them 0.64 seconds longer to heal, and 3.2 seconds longer to do a generator for each of the survivors that fit into the criteria. Now let's talk about the pros and cons for Thanat, starting off with the pros. The first and most obvious one is that Thanat is a pure and simple passive perk. In any given match, if you aren't injuring, downing, and hooking survivors, you're doing something extremely wrong. Thanat requires absolutely no babysitting or playstyle warping whatsoever. The second pro is that Thanat plays kind of almost triple duty in the slowdown department. Yes, it slows down repair and healing speed like I just talked about, but it can also encourage survivors to waste time healing, keeping them off of generators and slowing them down even more. The third and final pro is honestly more of a neutral, but Thanat does kind of slot in pretty well with some killers' playstyles and powers. Especially on killers such as the Plague or the Legion, where you can kind of keep people injured fairly frequently, and even on some stealthier killers, you're almost guaranteed to keep people injured pretty consistently and pretty easily if you're using your power. So now let's talk about the cons for Thanat. The first and most well-known con for Thanat is that it just isn't that much of slowdown. They considered buffing it in the past for this reason, because it is kind of underwhelming, but for some reason they just kind of backed out on the buff. 0.64 seconds of extra healing time and 3.2 seconds of extra generator time per injured survivor is fairly underwhelming. Most high-ranked survivors just straight up ignore it and keep playing the game as they normally would. Sure, you do still slow down their actions a bit, but it isn't really that much in the grander scheme of the game. And the second and final con for Thanat is maybe a bit of a nitpick, but despite literally meaning the fear of death, it doesn't count sacrificed or dead survivors for slowdown. I assume this is done to keep the game from feeling like it's getting progressively worse for survivors as they lose more and more teammates, since being down a player or two is kind of already enough of a detriment. I do think that with the piss poor numbers on Thanat, behavior could make it count dead survivors and it still wouldn't matter all that much. And our next perk is Thrilling Tremors. Thrilling Tremors is a teachable perk from Ghostface and is unlocked at level 35. Thrilling Tremors will make it so that when you pick up a survivor, all generators not currently being repaired will become blocked for 16 seconds and have their auras highlighted in white for the duration. This effect has a cooldown of 60 seconds. So now let's get into the pros and cons for Thrilling Tremors, starting with the pros. The first pro is probably one that you're just kind of sick of hearing of, but Thrilling Tremors is a passive perk. No game warping to make this one work, you should be downing and picking up survivors during the normal course of a game anyways. The second pro is that Thrilling Tremors also serves as an information perk. Since it only blocks generators that are not currently being repaired, and therefore only highlights generators with no one near them, or repairing them, any generator that remains red has at least one survivor working on it. This can make it serve as almost a kind of a budget barbecue and chili, since you don't get perfect information with auras or any of those extra sweet blood points. Now let's move on to the cons for Thrilling Tremors. The first and most obvious flaw with Thrilling Tremors is that it doesn't block generators that are currently being repaired when it triggers. This means that sure, it'll block some generators off, but it doesn't stop the ones that have survivors on them. This is why, despite blocking off generators, which can technically slow the game down, I believe, and I think a lot of people will agree with me on this, Thrilling Tremors is more of an information or tracking perk than it is a slowdown perk. I included it in this list because it does technically prevent generators from being worked on, and I didn't want to keep any perk that has that benefit out of this list, but it's really an information tracking perk. And the second and final con is the large cooldown attached to Thrilling Tremors. I'm honestly not sure why behavior thinks that Thrilling Tremors is so busted that it needs a minute-long cooldown, but I'd be willing to wager that if they removed or just even reduced it a bit, it wouldn't really make a difference. Our next perk is Corrupt Intervention. Corrupt Intervention is a teachable perk from the Plague and is unlocked at level 30. Corrupt Intervention will cause the 3 farthest generators from you when you spawn to become blocked by the entity for 120 seconds. So now let's talk about the pros and cons for Corrupt Intervention, starting with the pros. The first pro is that 120 seconds or 2 minutes is a lot of time. This is especially helpful on killers that require some setup, namely Trapper and Hag. This is why you'll see a lot of Trappers and Hags running Corrupt Intervention, since it does give them a bit of freedom to get traps placed and get their map presence kind of set up. The second pro is a bit more of a neutral, since it does kind of depend on map spawns and isn't consistent, but typically survivors will spawn far away from you, and therefore be near the blocked off generators. This can force them to waste time finding a non-blocked generator to work on, and possibly even just make them come towards you in the early game, so you don't have to go find them. And the third and final pro is that Corrupt Intervention is one of those beautiful passive perks that requires absolutely no tending to. It's just a big, strong, independent perk that doesn't need you to babysit it or go out of your way to help it. It just works, Todd Howard style. So now let's move on to the cons for Corrupt Intervention. The first con is the obvious one. After 2 minutes, the perk just becomes an empty perk slot. Sure, it may have served its purpose, but you're still down a perk slot after 2 minutes. The second con is the same as the second pro to a bit of an extent. It is very map dependent. Since it does choose the furthest 3 generators from you when you spawn, it can pick some truly horrible generators to block based on where you've spawned and what map you're on. It can block generators that are so far away that survivors won't even realize that you have the perk equipped. Our next perk is Sloppy Butcher. Sloppy Butcher is a base killer perk and will be obtainable by every killer as soon as you put points into them and find it on your blood web. Sloppy Butcher will cause your basic attacks to apply hemorrhage and mangled to any survivor that you hit. I say basic attack because I tested it, yes. Sloppy Butcher used to work with certain killers' powers, such as chainsaws, hatchets, etc. However, in the most recent patch, when I tested it, it does not actually apply on anything other than the Legion's power, Feral Frenzy. The main portion of Sloppy that we're looking at here is the mangled effect, since it slows down the speed at which survivors are healed by 20%. This means that it will take another survivor healing them, or a self-heal with a medkit, an extra 3.2 seconds, and will make self-care take 6.4 seconds longer. So let's talk about the pros and cons for Sloppy Butcher, starting with the pros. The first and maybe the biggest pro of Sloppy Butcher is that it is a base killer perk. You can just start using it on any killer without leveling up another killer or getting a single teachable perk or something off the shrine. This makes it very helpful, especially for newer players, and is the reason you'll probably hear me recommending it a lot in my new player builds on my killer videos. The second pro is that the mangled status effect is just always a flat 20% reduction to healing speed, no matter what rank of Sloppy Butcher you have. Rank 1 is the same as rank 3 in terms of mangled. Mangled is a binary effect, meaning they either are or they are not mangled. It never scales. This is of course as of the most recent patch. They may change it in the future. I am not a sage. The third pro of Sloppy Butcher is that hemorrhage effect as well. In addition to increasing how much survivors bleed, making it a little bit easier to follow their blood pools, the mangled effect does somewhat encourage them to stay injured because of the slowed speed. This means that they may just choose not to heal, not only giving you an easier time downing them, but also making them grunt in pain for longer and leave those blood trails, which will make them easier to track down. And the fourth and final pro of Sloppy Butcher is that it's just a plain old passive perk. This applies on hitting survivors with basic attacks, as I said, unless you're Legion, and you should typically be hitting survivors with basic attacks when you're playing Killer. So now let's move on to the cons for Sloppy Butcher. The first con is that the mangled status effect seems to kind of get worse and worse, like every other patch, with new survivor perks that behavior puts in. In the most recent chapter, the Stranger Things chapter, they added not just one, but 2 free healing perks that completely ignore mangled. With the upcoming nerf to medkits and insta-heals, mangled will probably get a little bit better, but survivors do still kind of have a fair number of ways to ignore mangled at the present. And the second and final con of Sloppy Butcher is that a lot of survivors might just ignore healing altogether and just work on generators and then get a free heal from like adrenaline at the end of the match. Giving them the mangled status effect might just encourage them even more to not heal and just power through generators, which is kind of the opposite of what you want them to do. It's a little paradoxical, I know. This is just kind of a case-by-case basis thing, and you should expect most survivors to just kind of heal themselves or find someone to heal them. However, just keep in mind that when you get to higher ranks, survivors tend to be more confident about staying injured and will ignore Sloppy Butcher altogether. And the final slowdown perk for us to talk about is Surge. Surge is a teachable perk from the Demogorgon and is unlocked at level 30. Surge will make it so that when you down a survivor with a basic attack only, every generator within 32 meters will explode and have an additional 8% regression applied to them. Surge has a cooldown of 40 seconds. The explosion from Surge will deal the normal 10% regression for any failed skill check or generator explosion, as well as the additional 8%, making it regress a generator by 18%, or 14.4 seconds. Keep in mind that this is every generator within 32 meters. So if you land a Surge proc on 2 generators, it's 28.8 seconds of regression, and if you somehow manage the ever elusive 3 generator Surge, that's 43.2 seconds of regression. I talked about Surge a bit with Ottstarva after he made his Reddit post comparing Hex Ruin and Surge, which honestly was kind of one of the main reasons I completed this script, and wanted it to be my next video out of the many half-completed scripts I have just kind of lying around. So now let's talk about the pros and cons of Surge, starting with the pros. The first pro is that it's a passive effect, and one that will happen in the course of normal gameplay on basically every killer that isn't like Hillbilly or maybe even Huntress and sometimes Leatherface. You don't have to actively go out of your way to make Surge work, you just hit people with mouse 1 and then it works. You don't waste any time. The second pro is the one that most people seem to misunderstand about the perk Surge. The regression amount is 18% total. It's not just 8%. People see that 8% and they go, it's only 8%, why would I run it? It's 18% total, which is only 7% less than Pop Goes the Weasel. If you'll excuse the pun, Surge does also have that explosive potential to hit multiple generators, making it even better than Pop Goes the Weasel in terms of regression if it does happen to hit 2 or more generators. So now let's move on to the cons for Surge. The first one is one of the main things that people bring up when they talk about the negatives of Surge, the 40-second cooldown. So let's talk about it a little bit more in detail. Let's have an example match. Let's say for this, you're playing a basic killer like Wraith, who I really like running Surge on. So you down someone, Surge goes off and regresses the generator that they were working on, and then goes on cooldown. You take that survivor to a hook, put him on the hook, look around with barbecue, find who you want to go after next. You cloak up, zoom over to him with your Windstorm Med on, uncloak, get your easy first hit, and then they get to like a jungle gym or something. They loop the jungle gym, you get them to drop the pallet, they go to a less safe pallet, and you mind game them, and you down them again. This whole process is probably taking you longer than 40 seconds, and Surge will most likely be off cooldown and work again. Obviously, the cooldown can sometimes screw you over, but I really don't find it to be that big of a deal a majority of the time. The second con that is brought up with Surge is that it only works with basic attacks. I talked about this a bit before, but there are very few killers in the game that don't just use basic attacks to down survivors. The only exception is really Hillbilly if you're good at back revving, which, I mean, if you're playing Hillbilly at higher ranks, why aren't you good at back revving? You could argue that you can get downs with Huntress's Hatchets, Leatherface's Chainsaw, Pig's Dash Attack, Plague's Corrupt Purge, or Demogorgon's Shred. But a majority of the time on most of these killers, you're still going to be using basic attacks, or you're just not going to be running Surge because you don't need it. It is still a restriction, so I will put it in the cons, despite the fact that I think some people overestimate how many times they're actually going to down someone with something other than a basic attack. And the third and final con is the one that everyone seems to bring up a lot of the time, the range restriction on Surge. Yes, the fact that it doesn't hit every single generator on the map sucks, but that wouldn't exactly be balanced, now would it? People often bring up the fact that Surge just plain doesn't work on larger maps such as Mother's Dwelling or Mond Resort. This isn't actually true if you look at the layouts of the map, however. Sure, the maps are large, they're freaking massive, but the gens are typically spawned kind of clustered together. There's just a lot of dead space that's just loops or random piles of junk, trees, snow, pallets, whatever. Most gens spawn fairly close to other generators, so that if you manage to down someone between them, you can potentially get that double proc out of Surge. And even if you don't, hitting just one generator is still 18% regression, which as I said is only 7% less than Pop Goes the Weasel, and you don't have to waste time kicking the gen. Also, most maps are not Mother's Dwelling. They're not that big, and the majority of the maps are kind of on the medium size, where Surge is still pretty solid. And if you manage to get a map like the game, I mean, just cancel Christmas for the survivors, I guess. Once again, it is still a drawback, since survivors can play around it if they know you're running it, and just leave areas where generators have been worked on and run to parts of the map where either generators are completed or they know that nobody's touched gens and nullify Surge's usefulness. Now, before I wrap this video up and give the general tier list of Slowdown perks, there are two perks that I want to give a special mention to. The first perk is Remember Me. Remember Me is an obsession perk, and makes it so that each time you hit your obsession, you gain a token up to a maximum of 4 tokens. Each token slows down anyone who is not the obsession in their opening of the exit gates by 4 seconds up to a maximum of 16 seconds. The obsession is not affected by the slowdown. While not your traditional slowdown perk, since it doesn't hamper healing or generator repair speed in any way, it does slow down exit gate openings, so if you're looking to play for more of an endgame focused build, it can slow the game down, I guess. The other honorable mention is Hex Thrill of the Hunt. Hex Thrill of the Hunt is obviously a Hex perk, because it's in the name, and makes a Hex totem spawn. For each totem that you have still standing, meaning it hasn't been cleansed yet, you have a stack. For each stack, survivors' cleansing speed will be reduced by 6%. You will also gain a notification whenever a survivor begins cleansing a Hex totem, and 10% more blood points for actions in the Hunter category for each stack that you still have. Thrill, once again, isn't a traditional slowdown perk, since it doesn't affect healing or generator repair speeds, but if you're worried about totems being cleansed, either because you have another Hex perk that you want to defend, or you think that the enemy team is either running something like Inner Strength a bunch, or they're going to be cleansing your totems for some reason, Thrill will slow them down a bit. Thrill is typically only used in completely totem-based builds and mostly meme builds, but you do get a bit of extra time from them cleansing your Hex totems and normal totems, and you also get that notification for Hex totems so you can maybe go defend them. I actually completely forgot about the perk Calorophobia until I was in the editing stages of this video. Calorophobia will slow down the healing speed of all survivors in your tear radius by 50%. I forgot about Calorophobia because it's a very forgettable perk, and also just really not that great of a perk, and it doesn't actually slow down generator speeds, but I figured I should put it in here because I included Sloppy Butcher. So now let's round out the video with a quick tier list of slowdown perks, and a brief explanation of why I put each perk in the tier list that I did. A few quick disclaimers before we get into this. Obviously, this is all based on my opinion. I am a killer main, and I have a fair amount of time in this game, about 1600 hours at the time of making this video. I don't have any delusions of grandeur, however. I am nowhere near the best killer player in this game at the end of the day, and this is just my personal opinion. I will try and put all bias aside, but as many people know, that's not entirely possible all of the time, and I will take into consideration opinions from other killer mains who I respect a great deal. This tier list will also be geared towards high rank play on PC and against survivors with lots of experience. If you are lower rank, you may find that most perks will work since survivors aren't as experienced at the game. This tier list will also be killer agnostic, meaning that it is just a general overview of how they function in a vacuum, not on specific killers or specific builds. Sure, some perks will be better on specific killers, but I won't be factoring that into my rankings of the perks. I'll go in the same order that I did when we went over each perk and the pros and cons, so we'll begin with Dying Light. I personally think that, as I said, Dying Light is just too much of a win more perk, so I personally think it belongs in the D tier. It isn't the worst perk in the game, by any stretch of the imagination, but to really get that much use out of it, you're going to need to hook a lot of non-obsession survivors, and if you're already doing that, I really doubt you need to slow the game down. Next up is Hex Huntress Lullaby. Quite honestly, I find this perk to be extremely underwhelming, and as I said earlier, I'm not even sure why it's a Hex perk. I think it could not be a Hex perk, and I doubt people would play it at high ranks anyways. For these reasons, I'm going to have to put it in the F tier. Following up on that, we have Hex Ruin. I mean, this is a no-brainer, I'm not going to bury the lead or anything, it's S tier, everyone already knows this. Yes, you can cleanse it within seconds of starting up the match sometimes, but it's still unmatched in its ability to slow down generator progress while it stays up and running. I really wish behavior would give us a true alternative to Ruin, or just make the game slower in general, but if wishes were fishes, etc. Next up we have Overcharge. As I talked about earlier, Overcharge requires you to go so far out of your way to make it work, I don't even think it's worth it. The skill check can be hard to hit if you combine it with like Unnerving Presence, but then you're wasting your time kicking gens and dedicating 2 perk slots that could just be used for better perks. I'm gonna have to put Overcharge in the F tier. And then we have maybe the most contentious perk, Pop Goes the Weasel. This one is going to cause commotion in the comments section no matter where I put it. It's a somewhat passive perk, but you do have to go out of your way to kick generators, and that can lose you a fair amount of time, especially if you know that a generator farther away has a lot of progress. And as I said, high rank killer is a game of seconds. I honestly think Pop Goes the Weasel is a fairly good perk. The generator regression that it puts out is a lot when you use it, but you do have to kind of go out of your way to make it work. Weighing all the pros and cons for it, I think Pop Goes the Weasel belongs in the B tier. Next up we have Thanatophobia. As I said, this perk is the super passivist of all the passive perks, and you should be injuring, downing, and hooking survivors throughout the course of your normal killer gameplay. However, the numbers on it are just really weak. I think it's going to need a buff to be a real consideration outside of running super specific builds, so I'm going to have to put it in the D tier. Now we move on to Thrilling Tremors. I'm not going to bury the lead on this, it's F tier in terms of slowing the game down. This perk is a tracking perk. If you're using it for slowing the game down, you're going about playing killer all wrong, I'm sorry to tell you. It's a decent enough tracking perk, but it doesn't slow the game down in any meaningful way, and that's kind of the point of this video, so it's F tier. Moving on, we have Corrupt Intervention. Corrupt Intervention has a fairly potent effect of just straight up blocking generator progress for 2 minutes on 3 generators. This can buy you some time in either setting up or tracking down survivors in the start of the match to get your pressure rolling. That said, it does only work for 2 minutes, not the entire match, and then it becomes an empty perk slot. I think Corrupt Intervention belongs solidly in the middle, at the C tier. Now we move on to the most common perk of the bunch, Sloppy Butcher. Sloppy Butcher has a pretty decent effect, slowing survivors' healing down by 20%. It doesn't directly interact with generator repair speeds, but it can help you with pressuring the survivors, especially if they don't heal themselves, making it easier for you to down them, or making them go out of their way to find someone to heal them. I think Sloppy Butcher is pretty middle of the road as well, so I'll be putting it in the C tier, alongside Corrupt Intervention. And finally, we get to Surge. I've said my piece on Surge and the breakdown of the pros and cons, and way too many times on stream. People are probably sick of me talking about it. I think Surge belongs in the A tier. 18% regression on generators around you when you down a survivor can add up pretty quickly if you get it to work pretty consistently, and if you even get just 1 or 2 double or god forbid triple procs in a match, survivors are going to feel it. And that's it for this episode of Entity Education, covering the slowdown perks for killers as of the Demogorgon patch, patch 3.2, or roughly the time period of October 2019. Thank you as always for watching. I appreciate everyone who watches these videos. As I said, if you disagree with anything I said in this video or my rankings of a perk, please feel free to leave a comment on what you disagree with and why. I always like hearing other people's opinions. I'll see you guys in the next major scripted video, which will hopefully be the one covering the nurse rework if they ever actually stop having unforeseen circumstances and push it live. I'll try to make more scripted and focused videos like this in between the major patches or killer releases, but some weeks there may just be stream highlight videos. I'm kind of a pretty busy guy at the end of the day. Thank you once again for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.